Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month slows. Full terms at mintmobile.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month slows. Full terms at mintmobile.com.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates, like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Super real.
Hey, I'm Julian Morgans, and you're listening to What It Was Like, the show that asks people who have lived through big, dramatic events what it was like. Hey, and welcome back. This is part 2 of our look at an Australian cult called The Family. Last week, I spoke to a guy named Ben Shenton, who grew up in the cult until he was 15. His episode really sets up the story for this episode, so if you haven't heard it yet, maybe stop this one and go and check it out. But for the rest of you, here's a quick recap. The family operated in Victoria from the mid-1960s until 1987, when the police raided a property on Lake Eildon and forcibly removed a bunch of children from their care. For decades, they'd pretended to be this actual family, and they'd illegitimately adopted all these kids who were raised to believe that the group's guru, Anne Hamilton-Byrne, was actually their mother. But after the raid, the group went into a period of slow decline. Most of the members, they kind of dropped off, leaving only a hardcore group of believers in orbit around Anne and her husband Bill. But on paper, the group was still alive and well. They owned property throughout Australia, the US, and the UK, with some estimates putting their total wealth at around $50 million. But the thing was, there'd been no consequences. They'd hurt a whole lot of kids, and there'd been no justice. I don't know about you, but I found hearing Ben's story last week, there were some parts of it that were pretty hard to listen to. You know, he'd grown up in a world that was just all about punishment. If he broke the rules, he was punished, or if someone else broke the rules, they were punished, and maybe him too. They were thrashed with a cane, or they had their heads held under water in a barrel. And then there was that story, you know, that really intense story about the 16-year-old girls who were forced to take heavy doses of LSD while locked in a room for a few days, and how changed they were, how spaced out they were when they were finally let out. And, I mean, maybe a few years ago I'd have heard a story like that and it wouldn't have really affected me, but these days I'm a dad, you know, when I hear something like that and I'm just like, yeah, I don't know. I feel a bit angry. And I don't think I'm alone with that instinct, because today we're getting the second half of the story from a cop who heard about the way this cult was treating kids, and he got a bit angry too, and he decided to intervene. This was Lex De Man, and at the time, in 1987, he was a senior sergeant with the Victorian Police, and Lex ended up spending almost 5 years investigating Anne Hamilton-Byrne and the abuse perpetrated by the family. Today, he's going to talk about how he managed to have Anne arrested and hauled into court. And I won't spoil the ending, other than to say it doesn't quite finish how you'd expect. And the other thing I found surprising was just how reluctant the police were initially to investigate. As you'll hear, Lex had to basically force his boss's hand by highlighting that the group was using LSD because child abuse, somehow, it wasn't enough to get their attention. And I think it's actually in this way that you get a snapshot of Australia in a very different time period. Listening to this story about this cult, you just sort of keep thinking, how does this happen? And I think part of the answer is that this was Australia in the 1970s and the 1980s when doctors and lawyers, they were just seen on this level of respectability, and they were joining the cult and making the whole thing seem legitimate. And I think it's a world before Netflix, before true crime podcasts, in which a cult on the outskirts of Melbourne could fly under the radar without arousing too much curiosity. You know, today, if it was discovered that there was a cult in Melbourne and it was as weird, you know, the optics with the bleached hair and stuff, it was as weird as that, the 24-hour news cycle would just be all about it. It'd be all over Reddit. 60 Minutes would be bashing down their door. I would be trying to bash down their door, but not then. The word cult, it just didn't invite fascination like it does now. So we're going to talk to Lex about all of that. And these days, Lex is actually the CEO of Victoria Police Legacy. And as you'll hear, he's a quietly wise and humbly impressive Aussie bloke. And I had the pleasure of meeting him in person at his studio in Melbourne. So now, I bring you Lex De Man. Lex, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's start with an introduction. Who are you?
Who am I? Who am I? That's a very good question, that. Born and raised in Greensboro in Victoria. Mm-hmm. Born in 1960, so it just makes me 64. One of two. I'm a twin. And then at the age of 17, I started a cadetship and joined Big Pole in January 78 as a cadet, and then became a cop.
So you started out in the arson squad?
No, I didn't start in the arson squad until back in the 1980s. I was a police officer that used to stand on the intersections in Melbourne with the white slips waving the traffic through and controlling the traffic. I stayed there until 81, and then I went to Heidelberg police station. I picked up a vacancy there, and I was at Heidelberg for a number of years as a detective until I joined the arson squad in the December of 1987. I was on call with another friend of mine who was in my crew, and there was a fire in a primary school, Monbulk Catholic Primary School. So we were called in by the locals. We went up there to have a look at the fire. And really, that's when, in many ways, my life within Big Pole changed, because I got to hear of this cult. So how that happened was, at the fire, one of the things you do at school fires is always ask, if it's in a classroom, you know, was there a vendetta or something against the relevant teacher, the particular teacher that was in that classroom. And there was this young fellow that we were told about who was infatuated with this teacher. And I was told that he belonged to this cult called The Family. I've never heard of it before. And I was told that he'd been in this cult, or he was a member of this cult.
This was the principal of the school who was telling you this?
No, this was just through the investigations. Okay. Various, I can't recall who it was. But I did end up speaking with them. The local Monbulk police were telling me about this cult, and I hadn't heard of it before. And I ended up talking with the local police doctor they had in those days in regions, in areas, the district's police doctor.
Okay.
And I was speaking to the police doctor, and he'd been involved in supporting with this raid that had occurred up at Eildon back in the August of 1987, and he told me this story about these children being rescued by AFP and the Blackburn Community Policing Squad, and that they were children of this cult. The other thing he said to me was, don't get involved, because if you get involved with this, it'll be with you for life. Here I am today. I'm talking about it.
He was right.
He was right.
He was right.
But so on the Sunday, I met one of the girls who had left the cult or escaped from the cult, was still very closely aligned, a very young girl called Sarah. She was the oldest of the group of children. And I remember seeing her at this flower show on the Sunday up at Elinda. And it was just a bizarre meeting. She obviously hadn't been brought up in the normal atmosphere of what young kids do.
So what is it about, the look on Sarah's face? Why did that hit you?
Oh, just that blank look, as if she didn't know where she was and hadn't experienced life as a child. It was and very pale. I remember that, and I thought, this is not good. How can we as police, how can we as adults not do everything we can to help these kids?
How old was she?
At this stage, I think she's about 17, 18.
Okay. All right.
But we became very, very good friends through the investigation and beyond, when she had, when the case had finished. And I would talk to her, at times throughout the years. And sadly, she passed away, and I was asked by her natural mother, paternal mother, whether I would speak at the funeral and give the eulogy, which I did.
That's great. I understand. She died by suicide a few years ago.
I prefer to call it, there were some substances in it, whether it was suicide or how the cause of death. I don't think it's ever been established, so I wouldn't say it was suicide.
Okay. But it sounds like she had a pretty tragic life.
Well, she did, and a number of them have had a pretty harsh life, but a number of them, many of the then children who are now adults, they've gone on to live a normal life. Their mothers, their fathers, they've got kids of their own, grandkids, and so I take my hat off to them all the time. Yeah, of what they've been through as children, thinking that they were children of Anne Hamilton-Byrne, and who was the cult leader, and William Hamilton-Byrne. Then all of a sudden, this raid happens on the 14th of August 1987, and they're told they're not your natural parents. And then to find out who their actual parents are and the circumstances surrounding that, obviously, it's pretty traumatic. But my hat goes off to all of them, the way that they've gone on with their lives. And, the lesson that I've always wanted to talk about with this case is about, this isn't some bizarre American deep south cult. This actually happened on the doorsteps of Melbourne. It was based out of Mount Dandenong, out at Ferny Creek. And these children were secreted at Eildon for many years. Yeah, so it's about making sure the community understand that this is what happened. It happened here in Melbourne.
I grew up in Mount Dandenong, which I think contributes to my fascination with the case. I knew the lodge. I knew the sort of the cult headquarters, because as a kid, I went to Mount Dandenong Primary School, and the kids would talk about, this cult. They used to own this lodge down the road. I remember if you had a BMX bike, the trick was to do a skid on their driveway as, your sign of disrespect. And I remember finding it fascinating and surprising. So that is a long lead up to say, when you were a young detective in the Arson Squad, end of 1987, and you first hear this story, were you surprised? Were you shocked? Were you intrigued?
I was intrigued by the story. I'd never heard of it really, this cult. And I was intrigued by it. And, my primary focus at that stage, of course, was to investigate the fire. But as we started to investigate the fire, I started to understand a little bit more about the cult and the stories behind the cult, and I could see the frustration of the local community policing squad at Blackburn. They tried to investigate what had gone on with the cult. They'd been involved with the raid, and they were coming up, against brick walls and so forth. 'Cause in those days, it was seen as more as a child welfare issue. So we'll give it to the community policing squad to deal with.
Was that because they couldn't be bothered or they were under-resourced?
No, I think it was just the culture of society in those days.
Yeah.
And I took a different view that when you start to hear stories about children being stolen at birth and the administration of LSD with children and so forth, I took a different view, as did my colleagues. And I started to say, well, this is more than just a child welfare matter. It to me that there had been a bit of an injustice had been done. A lot of an injustice had been done with the maternal mothers. You got to remember in those days, in the 70s and into the 80s, there wasn't much support for especially in the 70s, unmarried girls, teenagers. And so often these girls would be, they'd disappear from their normal home environment and so forth and appear 10, 11 months later. They've been away working or been studying elsewhere, but in actual fact, they were pregnant and had given birth. And, unfortunately, some of the doctors involved were members of the cult. And you start to hear these stories and so forth. And after 3 months of investigating the fire, it was coming to a dead end with regards to any possibility of finding the offender or whatever. And so I was told to drop the case for the future and get on with other jobs. But I kept a strong interest in what was happening with the cult.
Can I ask, so I'm assuming you'd have heard quite a few horrible stories about what this group was up to at that time. Was there a story that Sarah told you, or was there a story that you heard that particularly stayed with you?
Oh, there are so many stories and circumstances of it. And, there's a couple of things I've been told in confidence by Sarah that will always stay in confidence. I will never share.
No, of course. I'm looking for an anecdote that illustrates the severity or the seriousness of this.
Well, there had been some severe corporal punishment handed out to the children by a couple of the aunties, what they call aunties. They were sect members who were nurses. They'd do 2 weeks on at Hilton, then they'd do 2 weeks off. In their off time, they'd work in a hospital to have enough money to pay for the food when they went back for the next 2 weeks. The phone being held out so that Anne could hear the administration of the corporal punishment to the children, the dunkings in the bucket of their heads, like they were drowning in the bucket by the aunties and so forth. The education department went along and had a look at the house, and the room had been set up like a school room. All the children were dressed up in the same outfits with peroxide hair, blonde hair. All this bizarre stuff was being told and was happening, and thank God Murray Moore and a current affair actually raised in the public arena. So there was more knowledge of it. And I took a lot more interest in that. And then in the June of 1989, through my maintaining my interest in the job and speaking with people, I was asked to go to Nunawading police station to the detectives area, and I had 2 weeks to do a report. So I spent the 2 weeks putting a report together, and I used the words allegations of administration of LSD into children and the alleged theft of children from birth. And so the department couldn't ignore it.
These were buzzy phrases that you deliberately put in.
Oh, absolutely. And it was in the late November of 1989 that I was called into a meeting with the then Detective Chief Inspector at the drug squad, where the file had landed because of the terms that I'd used about LSD and drugs, that I was asked, I wasn't really asked, I was told that I'd be part of a task force. I'd be joined by a senior sergeant, detective senior sergeant, and 4 detectives, and we had 12 weeks to clean it up. So we started in December. I remember walking into the room at Russell Street at the drug squad, and there's 4 desks, there's filing cabinets, there's 2 typewriters, no car, and seeing 5 other people who I'd never met before, and we're the task force. And there was no resources. basically, and we had 12 weeks. So I had to brief the team on my knowledge at that stage of the cult and then work from there.
Okay. Were you feeling optimistic? Were you feeling a bit like...
Oh, no, I never forget a meeting I had with, just within the week that we started the task force, I met with Mari and she's a tremendous person, and she said to me, you'll never find her.
Sorry, Mari's from Current Affairs?
Yeah, you'll never find her. And if you find her, you'll never charge her. And if you charge her, you'll never get a conviction at court. So there was three good reasons, I thought, to do what we could to find her and to look into the case, and then if charges were there, to do that. And so it was a bit of a challenge.
So you got 12 weeks. Where do you start with a thing like that? Where do you even begin?
So it was about talking to the children and just getting statements from them. First of all, getting the confidence of them, which took some time. And when you start to then get the story from their perspective, remembering that they didn't know much about their lives, they've been brought up thinking they were Anne Hamilton-Byrne's children. We start to look back about trying to find out through documentation where they actually were born. During the investigation, there were a number of times where, we knocked on the door of a house, and someone would come to the door and you would say to the woman, "Are you X? Did you give birth to a baby 14 years ago, 15 years ago, 13 years ago?" And the horror on their face. Because, of course, they had moved on. They'd had their own families, and they had basically, in their mind, the child that they had given birth to had been adopted out and so forth. In some cases, the mothers hadn't seen the children following the birth. And then once we started doing that, that didn't take 5 minutes. That took some lot of months and so forth, and starting to get into the second year and so forth. But we'd heard through the cult that the lawyer, a man, Hamilton-Byrne, who had falsified almost all, if not all, of the documentation in relation to property transactions, birth certificates, etc., had a falling out with Anne and had left the cult some 6 months earlier. So we started to look at the birth documents and property and so forth. And one thing that documents don't do is lie. People lie on documents. Documents don't lie. And Peter Spence, who was the senior sergeant, located a document signed by the solicitor, the lawyer for Anne Hamilton-Byrne, Peter Kibbe, and it was clearly perjury. He'd committed perjury on the document, and we were able to prove that. And we located Peter in a small country legal practice down at Camperdown in Western Victoria. So we had a warrant issued, and one Monday morning at 9 o'clock, Peter and I fronted up at the solicitor's office, walked past the receptionist, straight into his office, announced ourselves, asked him if he was Peter Kibbe. He said yes. We then cuffed him and walked him from the solicitor's office into the police station at Camperdown, interviewed him on perjury on the document, and then had him bailed. And he despised Anne Hamilton-Byrne at this stage because his life had been ruined by Anne. He was a man who was intelligent. He had a mental health condition, where he was obsessive compulsive, and he would take 2-3 hours to have a shower. He was just obsessed about cleanliness. And I remember seeing his hands for the first time, and they were white, large white hands, just from the continual washing.
Like he'd bleached them or something.
Yeah, well, basically, yeah. He was very conscious of dirt, and at one stage there, whilst in the cult, Anne had arranged for him to have a lacotomy, with that surgery through the eye, to try to rectify his obsessive compulsiveness. But of course, that didn't eventuate. And Peter was told to marry a particular woman in the cult She's another victim, and they had 2 boys, and one of them eventually committed suicide because of the upbringing in the cult and the whole dysfunctioning within the family, and so she's only got the one boy left, and Peter sadly has passed on now. But Peter told us this story and about the documentation about the perjury. Didn't say much, but we said to Peter, if you have a think and help us, the perjury charge which you'll go to the county court for, I gave him a guarantee that I would go Queen's evidence for him. I would get up in the box and I would give character evidence for him that he's been of great assistance to Victoria Police. Because he was facing jail as a solicitor. It's a very serious offence for a solicitor to commit perjury, especially on documents, birth documents and so forth.
When you're saying perjury, you mean like he was just forging documents? Forging
documents, yes. It's an offence of perjury.
Okay.
And so about a week later, Peter rang me and said to Peter and I, I'll have a chat with you. So we went and met him up at his house at Olinda with his wife. And I think they had come to bond together. Whether there was love there, I'm not sure, but they become a very close couple bond through their experiences within the cult. And Peter said he would be prepared to turn Queen's evidence and tell us everything he knew if we were true to our word. So for about, from then on, for about the next 3 months, I'd pick Peter up every morning at 9 o'clock from his house at Olinda. We'd drive to St Kilda Road Police Headquarters. I'd take down his statement, handwritten statement. We'd have photocopies of documents that he would refer to and so forth. And I think the statement ended up to about 365 handwritten pages of evidence from Peter, which he then read back on tape. And that then was a great assistance. And as we were talking to Peter, this was in 1990, early 1990, he then was telling us about one of the aunties who was Pat McFarlane, who had left the cult also out of disgust for Anne. And, Peter was so funny. He'd just say, I hate the bitch, but he'd always have his hands up like this, so he wasn't touching anything.
His clean white hands.
Yeah. And so he told us that she'd be prepared to talk to us, but she was in the United Kingdom.
Right.
And she wasn't going to come back.
Before we go to the United Kingdom, I just want to unpack Peter. So you heard Peter's story, right? You sort of came to understand how this intelligent man, this lawyer, became, indoctrinated by this.
So you've got to go back with Peter, to when he was diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder and his visit to New Haven Private Psychiatric Hospital in Normandy Road, Kew, where professionals in those days, in the 60s, late 60s, mid to late 60s, early 70s, went to for treatment. Professionals, I mean those in the legal circle, doctors, lawyers, nurses, psychiatrists, people of standing within the community who had suffered trauma through their life. Peter was obviously suffering trauma with his obsessive compulsiveness. There are others who had lost children through other causes and so forth. And whilst at New Haven, they were administered with the hallucinogenic drug LSD by another cult member, Dr. Howard Whittaker, who was licensed at that stage to administer LSD as an experimental drug. There was only one of 2 doctors, my understanding was, in the state that were able to administer LSD in that situation. And another person, another cult member by the name of Dr. John Mackay. And so under the effects of the drug at night in a dark room, they would see a figure at the doorway of the room with a bright light behind them, and the figure would be in a white flowing gown with smoke emanating from behind, and they were convinced that they had seen Jesus Christ reincarnated in the female form, and it was Anne, and it was dry ice behind her in a bucket. that was giving that effect. So under the drug, and then that was cemented in them about Anne being the Messiah.
God.
And that's how they were indoctrinated into the cult in many instances.
She wasn't averse to a bit of melodrama.
No, she was a very charismatic and very attractive woman in those days. Yeah. And so that's how Peter became part of the cult. He had believed that he had seen Jesus Christ reincarnated in the female form, and that she would help him with his illness. And then it took many years for him to realise it was just a complete sham. Like other cults, it's people say to me, what did she want? Quite simple, money and power. That's it. Every cult, look at it, money and power is what the leader wants, no matter what cult you're looking at.
Did Peter reveal to you what the catalyst for his disillusionment was? When did he give up?
I had a big blue with her, and he started to find out, after years about the facts, and there were other cult members that had started to leave the cult, become disillusioned, and, so there's this whole air of, there were a number of people that were leaving the cult. A bit like, Trish McFarlane, she had been one of the aunties up at Eldon for many, many years and realised, that it was all a front, basically. She escaped, she left, and she went to England.
So in some ways, it feels to me like the horse had already bolted. There'd already been a raid on the Mount Dandenong property. There'd already been a raid on the Eldon property. By this point, many of the members had sort of disbanded and gone into...
Oh, there was still a hardcore group of people.
Yeah?
And that were hands folders. I wouldn't say that the horse had bolted.
Okay.
I would more say that the horse was being brought into account.
Yeah, so I guess that's what I'm getting at is, what was driving you? Was it as just a mission for justice?
Well, when you having spoken with the children and getting to know the children, and then also some of the cult members who themselves were victims, it was and knowing that she was somewhere and she needed to be held to account, and him, but more so her, needed to be account the lives she had destroyed. And I also always had Mari's words in the back of my mind: "You'll never find her, you'll never charge her, you'll never get her back, you'll never get a conviction." And so it was a personal drive from me and members of the team. And through the life of the task force, there were, in our last 12 months of DPP, we had a Crown prosecutor working with us that I could run things past and so forth, in particular when we got to the stage of issuing a warrant for Anne's arrest. Then that became an international arrest warrant, and going through that whole process. And
tell me about the first time that you met Anne.
First time I met Anne was the day that we went across to the United States, and I had a female doctor, police doctor. The reason we had the police doctor is during the extradition process between ourselves and the United States courts, she said she had a heart complaint.
Of course.
And she couldn't fly. So I said, well, that's all right, we'll bring a doctor. Yeah. And so we brought a Victorian doctor there, and she was examined in prison, and she was found to be quite okay, but we had the doctor there as a reassurance, and that's how we brought her home. But so, when I first saw her was on that last day of leaving the United States. But I remember we were at JFK Airport, and this big black van turns up. It was a US Marshal's van, and this door slid open, and there was this crumpled up, little old, withered lady, like a little old grandma. She was in chains. And I said to her, "Anne Hamilton-Byrne, my name's Lex De Man, Senior Sergeant to Victoria Police in Australia, here to escort you back to Australia." She looked at me and she said, "Oh, you don't look as old as I thought you would be." And apart from those words, the other words she said to me was no comment. They're the only words that Anne's ever spoke to me. So we brought her back, brought her and him, her husband, William, back to face the justice system here.
Hey, so we're just going to stop here for a quick ad break, but stick around because we'll be right back with more What It Was Like.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
How would you like to look 5 years younger? In a clinical study, people that had volume added with Juvederm Voluma XC in the cheeks perceived themselves as looking 5 years younger at 6 months after treatment. Look younger, feel like you. Add volume for lift and contour in the cheeks with Juvederm Voluma XC. Reverse signs of aging by adding volume to smooth laugh lines with Juvederm Volure XC. For important safety information and to find a licensed specialist, visit Juvederm.com. That's JUVEDERM.com. Not for people with severe allergic reactions, allergies to lidocaine, or the proteins used in Juvederm. Common side effects include injection site redness, swelling, pain, tenderness, firmness, lumps, bumps, bruising, discoloration, or itching. There's a risk of unintentional injection into a blood vessel, which can cause vision abnormalities, blindness, stroke, temporary scabs, or scarring. Talk to a licensed specialist to find out if it's right for you.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
I've heard you describe Anne Hamilton-Byrne as the most evil person you've ever laid eyes on.
Absolutely.
Why is that?
When you understand what she did to destroy some lives, and I won't go into detail on that, you know, I'm aware of what happened with some of the victims, I call survivors, and the many lives she ruined. I've never met anyone more evil. She was able to break up people's marriages. She destroyed the lives of young girls, unmarried mothers. She destroyed the lives of some outstanding individuals who became victims themselves of cult members. She was the most evil person I've ever known. And, you know, the day that I heard that she died, you know, it was one of the happiest days of my life, to be blunt. And I said that on TV that night. You know, it is one of the most happiest days of my life to see her dead.
What drove her?
Well, she was a simple railway worker's daughter born in Sale, Victoria. What drove her in the end, as I said, power and money. Bit of an ego. She was well connected in the Melbourne establishment. Never paid for anything in her life. Accumulated property in the United States, the United Kingdom, in Victoria. You know, Victoria Grove, Ferny Creek, at the one stage, every house in the street was owned by the cult except for one. You know?
I mean, when you say that she's the most evil person you've ever met, that implies to me a certain sadism or malevolence. But I don't know if she deliberately set out to hurt people or whether people were just sort of cast aside as, like, you know, collateral damage on her way to glory and greatness.
Yeah, I can't think of the psychiatric term at the moment, but she certainly enjoyed destroying lives. It's hard to say in 2024 for people to have an understanding of the harm and the hurt that she caused. And that's why I go back to the survivors, to see where they are today compared to where they were. And when you see, police officers deeply affected, mentally affected by the stories they're being told, you then get an appreciation of the evil that this woman actually not only was capable of, but did.
I know that she didn't ever go to jail. What happened?
Oh, she served jail in the United States on remand, which was the best we could do. The legal system in those days, there were a number of charges in relation to New Zealand, for all of those documents that I talked about. So we charged her with perjury, numerous counts of perjury.
Okay.
And that was because of the lies that were told on the documents. There was a deliberate decision. What would we achieve by putting some of the survivors in before the court, in the witness box? Would we do more harm than good in a psychological sense? They'd been through enough. They'd been through, enough trauma in their lives. So we decided to go on the paperwork. And there was a huge legal fight when we finally got Anne and William back about the charges in New Zealand, whether the Victorian courts could hear those charges and so forth, and that went on for a number of months. And in the end, it was decided that we couldn't proceed on those charges. So Anne and William were charged with the perjury on the falsification of birth documents. And after that 4.5, nearly 5 years of investigation and the trauma that it caused members of the cult, they walked out the court with a paltry $5,000 fine. And I remember walking out of the court, and I walked across the Flagstaff garden, and I just let out one big scream. It was, a very costly investigation in many ways. And, after you invest 4.5, 5 years of your policing career, and knowing that that's all the court could do. And years later, I met the actual judge, and in another setting, and became friends with him. And, he was as frustrated then because he had to do what the statute said. That's all we could do. So the real, the thing that I took away from there was, the followers had seen their so-called Messiah before the courts, and I remember we found her, we charged her, we put her before a court, and she pleaded guilty. She said the word guilty. And just to hear those words from her mouth gave a little bit of satisfaction, and then, of course, they were released after paying the fine and allowed to go back to the hills.
Did she ever show any remorse?
No. And all her cult followers didn't show any remorse at all, and up until the day that she died, a number of her cult followers were still believing that she was the Messiah. And so, I did say in an interview at one stage, I said, I'll come back here in 3 days' time and see if she's come back to life, and I'll know whether I've been right or wrong. Saying that facetiously, but, the sad part, the sick part, as I call it, she had Alzheimer's towards the end, and she would sit rocking in a rocking chair at a nursing home with one of those little plastic baby dolls all day.
What was that about?
I have no idea, but it was just sick. I go back and I think she was just the most evil person I'd ever met.
Yeah. I'm sorry that she only got $5,000 fine.
Yeah, and that was part of the story as well. She only got $5,000 fine, and that was our legal system.
If you had your time again, would you pursue the same prosecution strategy?
Well, the prosecution strategy we had then was what we had to work with, but we worked our tails off and did what we could within the constraints of the law that was in place in Victoria at that time. And it's part of Victoria's criminal history that I hope others in the future can learn from.
I think, so there was a lot of people probably who had sort of glimpsed something, they knew something wasn't right, but they decided, too hard basket. You were really the first person who decided, no, I'm going to throw a couple of years at this. And I'm interested about your take on that. Why did other people just look the other way?
I think maybe because it got too hard. Maybe they had other interests. I'd always been one, and I always am one, to be there to help people. I have a simple, very philosophy of life. When we're no longer here, when we're lying in the coffin, and people are going, oh, how sad, how sad, how sad. If people can say he or she made a difference to another person's life, we've done our job. And that might sound a bit, philosophical, mumbo-jumbo, but I truly believe that each of us have got a duty in many ways to make life better for somebody else. And when the opportunity arose to say something the right way to get the investigation up and running, I took that opportunity. And I didn't think I'd spend the next 4.5 years on it. But, in a way, I'm glad I did.
So you say that we've all got a duty. Your philosophy of life is if you can see something bad going on, do your best to intervene or do your best to help.
Yep.
A lot of people would argue, yeah, but that's going to make my life harder. That's going to make my life worse. And here we are all these years later, this case has affected your life. So the question is it worth it?
I look at the alternative view. My life's been enriched by the people that I've met along the journey. When someone says thank you or gives you a smile, that's enough. And I don't say that lightly. I don't say that melodramatically. But to me, if a person just says thanks, you actually made a difference, or gives you a smile and you've made a difference. And that's what I think is lacking these days. You don't have to be paid to do something for somebody. Just do it.
I think that's a great philosophy. All right, Lex, I'm going to let you go. It's it's a horrifying story, but I'm glad you were there.
Yeah, fate is something in life, and I was there, and in a way, it was fate. I was on call. Had I not been on call that weekend, I wouldn't have probably got involved.
Hey, just a quick epilogue here from me to tie up a few loose ends. So first of all, Lex mentioned Anne's death in passing, but we didn't really get into it. So Anne died in 2019 at the ripe old age of 98 in a Melbourne nursing home. And really, she went out in a very unremarkable way. She'd been suffering from dementia, and apparently, by the very end, she couldn't really recognize anyone or remember much of her life at all. And her husband, Bill, he'd actually died a few years earlier in 2001, also just from general old age. And as for what happened to all of their money and property, well, they'd actually spent most of it by 2019, partly due to the costs of Anne's care. But the property that I was talking about at the very start, I was talking about this place with big gates. So after Anne died, that was put up for sale with an asking price of $1.1 million. But survivors of the cult that applied to receive a share of the proceeds with the court as part of their compensation claim. And from what I can tell, this is the only compensation that they received or they were in line to receive. And that's basically because, Anne pretty much got away with it. As you heard today, the matter of forcing kids to take LSD didn't even get brought up in court because Lex and his team didn't want to put survivors up on the stand. Anne just got away with it, and she died, not even remembering that it had happened. So in some ways, I feel like this story has a really, the ending's kind of a bummer. It's just one of those stories that you get sometimes in real life where the bad guys get away with it. And sure, Lex got Anne to say the word guilty, and yes, the regulation and process around adoption was dramatically tightened up after this case. But do I think that's enough? No, I do not. I think Anne should have gone to jail. And really, it was just luck, really. Lucky for her that she didn't. Thanks for listening. Please leave us a 5-star review on Apple and on Spotify. And we'd also love it if you'd follow the show. And did you know that we're on TikTok? If you've ever wanted to know what our guests look like, go and check out What It Was Like Podcast on TikTok. That's What It Was Like Podcast, all one word, with an @ symbol at the front. And it's exactly the same on YouTube, What It Was Like Podcast. Today's episode was produced by Rachel Tuffery. It was mixed by Jimmy Saunders, who also did our theme music. Evie Atkins is our intern, our cover art is by Naomi Lee Beveridge, and this whole thing has been a Super Real production.